I wasn't going to do an introduction, but I figured with how long it had been, one was required, so I decided to slap one right here before the beginning of the video. To start, I would like to apologize for the delay. Life and work made it extremely difficult to make time to do this video. As I've stated before, this is a hobby and I do this part-time. I love sharing this sort of stuff and I will continue to slowly make videos. Thank you so much for your patience as I continue to do these. Ladies and gentlemen, this will be a long journey through BattleTech history. When I say ladies, I really mean just one, so with that I've got to say, hi Mom! We'll be looking backwards from the year 3025. In 3025, the Great Houses have access to the ultimate battlefield weapons of their day, the BattleMech. From the catapult, Battlemaster, Panther, Archer, and the newest to see the battlefield, the Hatchet Man. We often forget these specialized mechs had a humble beginning, the granddaddy of them all, the mighty Mackie. We have to look back at history, weapons, military doctrine, politics, advancement in technology, and crazy personalities to get a greater understanding of the Mackie and its significance. Buckle up, this will be a long one. Scholars believe mankind first appeared approximately 250,000 years ago. Since then, and probably on the second day of our appearance, us humans have used war to resolve any kind of conflict. When Hellboy said, "War, War never changes. He was right to a degree. The way humanity wages war, the weapons, the strategies, the technology, they all change. Every war, conflict, defensive first strike, peacekeeping operation, and advancement in technology and industrial applications change how we fight and ultimately kill each other. What doesn't change is why we fight. We fight for food, minerals, black oily stuff, drugs, land, pride, and women. From sticks and stones to bronze spears, iron swords, steel-plated armor, to muskets, bolt-action rifles, machine guns, tanks breaking through barbed wire and over trench positions, to laser-guided missiles, we continue to invent new and more efficient ways to kill each other. As technology grew, so did our industrial prowess. At one time, war was fought in localized regions, often spanning years of deadlock and attrition. In the early 20th century, military and industry merged with devastating consequences or extreme efficiency, depending on your point of view. It was also the birth of mechanized war. The ability to deliver large amounts of men and material to the battlefield, or logistics, often became the deciding factor in warfare. What was once regional or localized wars was changed into continental to worldwide wars with ever-changing front lines. With aircraft and large-scale naval vessels, no nation was safe from devastation. Even with nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons being invented, war never slowed down in frequency and scale. The only unknown is whether or not WNDs would be used. In the early 2100s, as man took to the stars and began colonizing, war followed. The age of war is said to have spanned from 2236 to 2571, although the dates given here are somewhat disingenuous. I think the age of war started when man first appeared and has no expiration date. Once we took to the stars, it was only a matter of time before we bathed new planets in blood. As the Terran Alliance lost its grip on the furthest planets and star systems, new proto-nations began. These proto-nations would eventually become the Great Houses. As they grew, of course, conflict became a certainty. War in the early days of spacefaring was mostly a fight for space dominance using fighters and small spacecraft. In 2300, the Terran Alliance launched the first warship called the TAS Dreadnought. With the launching of the first warship, other nations soon attempted to follow. Every nation that had the financial capability began producing warships. Those nations that couldn't? Well, they're small footnotes in our history books. A warship's huge arsenal of weapons and armor meant that only another warship could rival their power. This is best exemplified when the Terran Alliance Civil War broke out. Admiral James McKenna used the TAS Dreadnought to orbitally bombard 2 uninhabited islands on Terra. The fighting immediately came to a halt, and the Admiral became the first Director General of the newly formed Terran hegemony. Once warships proliferated to all other nations, military doctrine underwent a massive change. While combined arms planetside was still a tried-and-true military strategy, a different way of fighting was needed with warships equipped with FTL drives. Warships and their fleets were used as a preemptive first strike option against their opponents. They would jump as deep as possible into enemy territory, rain fire from on high, land troops and claim victory, or leave and hit another system to keep the enemy guessing their next move. They were also used as a force multiplier in an already engaged fights planetside. The very sight of a warship coming into planetary orbit was enough to sway fighting to a stop, claim certain victory, or reverse a massive defeat. As the years and wars went on, communication and detection equipment was never developed, or at the very least, did not get the funding warship production and maintenance received. The hyperpulse generator network, giving the ability to communicate at FTL speeds, was still around 250 years away at this point. Bearing messages using jump ships meant that news from the front line was already weeks or even months old upon reaching a nation's command structure. With no proper means to communicate, or detection methods, fear and paranoia ruled the stars. Nations entered the mindset if your opponent could, they would. The only answer was to do it before your opponent did. Warship and fleet commanders were given new advanced orders as communications took far too long to have any meaningful impact in a conflict zone. These new orders given to commanders were, quote, deploy any and all weapons at your disposal to eliminate enemy resistance, At first, bathing a planet in mini-suns was, of course, used only sparingly, mostly to remove defenders that were dug in defensive positions. As wars dragged on, older and more veteran commanders left for retirement or died in battle. Newer, younger commanders took over these ultimate weapons of war. These younger commanders had only ever known a life of war and were much more aggressive with their deployments of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. On every front, every nation noticed matters were only getting worse. The warship, the king of the mountain, the ultimate weapon, had become every man, woman, and child of the border planet's worst nightmare. Ships would jump in system and rain heavenly fire on planets like the Greek gods of ancient Terra. Entire regiments would burn under mushroom clouds of fire, cities reduced to piles of ash, entire countrysides rendered barren by chemical weapons. The mere presence of resistance resulted in entire continents discovering the sun, in fact, had a taste. The age of war became a nightmarish existence of fear for the common civilian on border planets. The appearance of a single warship could spell doom for an entire planet. 2412 would change the rules of warfare for the coming centuries as the Free Worlds League invaded the Capellan Confederation and battled over the small planet of Tintvel. During the Age of War, the planet Tintvel changed hands multiple times between the Free Worlds League and the Capellan Confederation. During this time, it wasn't unheard for a border planet to change hands so many times that the civilian populace paid no attention to what Great House banner flew over their heads. Civilians on border planets had little to no care what nation claimed them as long as they had the essentials. Only when the squabbling of great houses bringing their warship to their planets did the civilians begin to take notice. As with all things in war and politics, it takes either a great event or a horrific tragedy for nations to begin to look for a change in policies and behavior. Tintvel would be that great tragedy. Two nations with their military doctrines of total war came to an explosive showdown on this small planet. The Free Worlds League invaded the Capellan Confederation and attempted to seize the planet. The Capellans dug in and readied themselves for a protracted ground battle. The ground battle never arrived. The Free Worlds League fired nuclear raindrops on their heads. The Free Worlds briefly took control of the planet, only for the Capellans to come back with their own warships. Once Free World troops were found dug in, the Capellans fired their nukes from orbit, turning FWLM troops and their defenses into molten slag. This back and forth continued until both armies took up positions in cities and towns. Civilians in the line of fire mattered for nothing as nuclear missiles continued to rain down. Eventually, commanders from both sides either realized the planet was worthless or they had lost too much before leaving. It was unfortunately too late. Over 300,000 civilians lay dead and much of the planet was barren. Tintvel was soon abandoned and considered sterilized. So much death and destruction for absolutely nothing gained. After Tintvel, it became clear that wholesale destruction of planets could not be continued. Chancellor Alicia Liao of the Capellan Confederation began a personal campaign to establish rules of war. What was once accepted military doctrine was now taboo. In 2412, on the planet of Aries, the Great House Lords met to establish these new rules of civilized warfare. The Great Lords were, at first, in favor of Chancellor Liao's proposal. Once face-to-face, smoldering rivalries were stoked with distrust and disdain. What was initially an 80-page draft of the new rules was quickly fought over, bloated, rewritten, and fought over some more. The 10 nations that were invited fought and added more clarifications to prevent misunderstandings and mistakes during wartime. Eventually, the 80-page draft became a thick rulebook of 6 articles and 18 appendices, nearing 320 pages. These articles and appendices accounted for every type of situation that may come up in war. Some of the articles were basic in understanding, such as Article 1, forbidding the use of nuclear weapons against civilian targets and planets. Many of the appendices were used to address what exactly constituted a combat force, uniformed combatants, and what was considered a uniform. Other appendices, like M and O, laid the groundwork for a neutral observer or a wartime referee. As circumstance would have it, frequently it would be the Terran hegemony, but we'll get to that later. On June 19, 2412, 8 of the 10 nations invited to the conventions signed and seemed generally happy with the outcome. But not everyone was happy with the new rulebook. The Taurian Concordat and the United Hindu Collective completely abstained. The Taurians had a long history of bloody rivalry with the Capellans. Before and after Tintvel, Liao forces had conducted planet-wide massacres against the Taurians. The Taurians refused to sign, calling the Capellans and the whole convention hypocritical. The United Hindu Collective refused to sign for other reasons altogether. They were not bloodthirsty or seeking to expand their borders through war. In fact, they viewed the conventions and the guidelines to war as something else entirely. The Collective viewed the new rules of war as a way to legitimize war on every level, and turned war into a sporting event, meant to settle any dispute. Prior to the Aries convention, old wars had slowed down. With a shiny new rulebook on how war was to be conducted, including a referee for a fair fight, new wars flared up. War, as the United Hindu Collective predicted, became a sporting event. With some great houses, it became a national pastime. Once again, military doctrine had to change. The mighty warship once used for awe-inspiring, devastating first-wave attacks against planets could no longer rain nuclear fire from above. The one-time centerpiece of every military had been sidelined to planetary deterrence and guard duty protecting dropships, making planetfall. War had been scaled down to low-level fighting on planets, mostly sparing civilians and their cities. Mostly. One thing is always true of humans: national pride, greed, and a lust for power will always find a way to bend the rules in their favor. In the center of all the warring nations was the Terran hegemony. Built on the ashes and failings of the old Terran alliance, the Terran hegemony was a beacon of light and the central hub of humanity. The Terran hegemony held the oldest and most developed of all the planets and star system. This included the birthplace of humanity, Terra. It was from Terra that humanity had spread its proverbial wings and took to the stars. Being the oldest and having the most developed of planets does not come without its own trials and hardships. By the 23rd and 24th centuries, natural resources were becoming limited. Needing resources and unable to carry out multi-front wars, the Terran hegemony turned inwards to find a new way to become dominant in the galaxy. In order to trade for resources, the hegemony needed a leg up on the other great houses. In 2343, Director General Michael Cameron established the Hegemony Research Alliance Department. This was expanded on in 2380 by Director General Margaret Cameron, updating laws regarding technology. The new laws would eventually become a cornerstone of hegemony economics. These laws created an official list of sensitive and secret technologies, which prohibited the items on the list from export. They also prohibited the dissemination of advanced hegemony technology without government approval, with extreme penalties if the laws were violated. Unofficially, the new laws became known as the Mother Doctrine. The Mother Doctrine also expanded government control over commercial, industrial, military, private, and public-funded research. Now that all research was centralized, the hegemony could begin picking and choosing technologies that would benefit their economy and military. The Camerons sought to protect the only advantage they had left: technology. Their technology already outpaced the other nations by nearly a decade. The only way they could survive as a nation was to protect and expand this disparity with the neighboring realms. This, of course, was not without growing pains. The initial startups of new research and development were not without significant cost. There were grumblings within the government about what success would look like. Those grumblings were soon silenced when portable fusion tech became available. Some corporations felt that the government was too restrictive and called the official list of sensitive and secret technologies the Cameron Blacklist. A few even ignored new restrictions to devastating consequence. The companies that ignored exportation laws quickly found themselves facing government seizure of their assets and treason charges brought against their executives. Corporate resistance to the Mother Doctrine was soon squashed. Within hegemony borders, the Mother Doctrine made huge strides in civilian and military technology and would raise the standard of living for all. The Mother Doctrine would help keep and eventually grow the technology gap with the other great houses. This gap, in return, allowed technology to be traded for resources that the hegemony desperately needed. The Terran hegemony largely stayed out of conflicts and became the largest producer of technology across the Inner Sphere. In accordance with the Aries conventions, the Terran hegemony was regularly asked to be a neutral observer and be on inquiry commissions. The Mother Doctrine, Aries conventions, and their self-imposed neutrality, most of the time, would eventually help lay the groundwork for the Star League. Rarely in military tech advancement does something just get invented. Normally advancement comes from a place of need. Tactics change, battlefields change, politics and technology change. Sometimes new rules for warfare get added. Military advancement can come from a combination of new tech and civilian advancement. A great example would be the first tanks to appear during the First World War on ancient Terra. A need arose and military tech answered with a way to move artillery in a protective shell that had the ability to roll over trenches and barbed wire. This is also true of the BattleMech. It took several tech advancements and a deliberate push from a non-traditional leader. In my opinion, it took two pieces of technology and a civilian industrial advancement to get the BattleMech thought of as worthy of military research. The first bit of tech we need to cover is called myomer. Think of myomer as synthetic muscles. Myomer was first developed in the early age of spaceflight. Unfortunately, due to its long strand length and its high energy requirements to cause a contraction, it was not researched more. It sat undeveloped for nearly 300 years. Once the Hegemony Research Alliance Department was established, Operation Musclebound received a huge amount of funding. Proper research could begin on myomer. The project was led by Professor Atlas. Yeah, Professor Atlas. What a name to be in charge of synthetic muscles. Professor Atlas and his team created the Schwarzenegger bicep. Editor's card here. Look, I know this is ridiculous, but this was written in 1988. What do you want? This bicep was a 2-meter long, 10-centimeter thick myomer bundle. This newly refined myomer bundle required less electricity and strand length to achieve more strength and coordination. On December 21st, 2350, testing of the Schwarzenegger bicep was wildly successful. The bicep contracted to 1/10 of its original size. It completely destroyed the testing harness and flung the 10-kilogram weights so violently and far, the researchers had to scramble for cover. With Operation Musclebound being so successful, it set the stage for industrial mechs. Industrial mechs were developed due to the limits of wheel and tracked vehicles in a variety of applications. They could go where other vehicles couldn't. The second piece of essential technology would develop the human-machine interface. The neurohelmet was developed and revolutionized that concept. A neurohelmet's main job is to allow the pilot or mech warrior to control the mech's balance. These helmets are used in conjunction with an internal gyroscope within the mech. Neurohelmets can also provide overlaying sensor displays, audio cues for threats, compressed 360-degree visual, and allow changing of communication channels. With practice and the use of a neurohelmet, mech warriors can perform a variety of feats, from tackling another mech to picking up sensitive objects in their mech's hands without squishing or destroying the object. Technology advancement in military applications generally takes some outside-the-box thinking as well. You need to be a special kind of genius or plain crazy. I give you Director General Jacob Cameron, the rockstar leader of the Terran hegemony. Jacob was the only child to Director General Richard Cameron and Northwind Duchess Jessica Dravens, born in 2416. Jacob was spoiled and doted on by his father. His mother taught him that he was morally and socially superior to others. Jacob grew to become overconfident and arrogant with a massive superiority complex. In 2433, Jacob became Director General of the Terran hegemony when his father died of a heart attack while taking a tour of hegemony research facilities. Soon after, Jacob would marry Constance Zell, a high-profile actress. As I said, he's a rock star. His marriage would do little to quell his arrogance, overconfidence, or his need to prove himself a capable leader. 2433 would see Jacob use the Hegemony Armed Forces, or HAF, to invade the Federated Suns and the Capellan Confederation, in pursuit of territorial gains and to prove his military and leadership superiority. By 2435, the offensive ended. The dual invasion resulted in very little gains and a huge cost of lives to the hegemony forces. The failed campaign began to see daily protests and even nobility attempts to remove Jacob from power. Jacob understood that his HAF forces needed something to tip the scales in his military's favor. He needed to fix his now bruised ego, get support of the public, and cement his legacy forever. Decades prior to Jacob becoming Director General, a conglomeration of industry giants intrigued with Myomer technologies, human-computer interface, and advanced weapons had been secretly working on a new weapons platform. This conglomeration reached out to Scobell Mechworks, who was already well known for their industrial mechs, for a new type of mechanized war machine. Scobell quickly began work on the future of battlefield technology. Before this new technology could be tested and unveiled to Director General Cameron, a test pilot needed to be chosen. History might say this pilot was chosen due to family nepotism and called-in favors. Colonel Charles Kincaid was part of the wealthy Kincaid family. The Kincaids were heavily invested in multiple successful weapons firms. Due to their investments and prestige, they enjoyed good relations with the Cameron family. One might say Charles Kincaid was forced into the Scobell test project by his father to gain even more honor, prestige, and influence for the family. February 5, 2439, the newly minted Mackie began its first live-fire test on the deserted hills outside of Yakima on Terra. The test was to see Colonel Kincaid pilot his Mackie against 4 remote-controlled Merkava heavy tanks. Kincaid fired up the new machine and quickly ran through its pre-test warm-ups. The neural feedback between man and machine was nearly perfect, as Kincaid piloted the mech as if it were a second skin. He trotted the mech out to the testing field and was promptly fired upon. The new armor plating designed for the Mackie absorbed the shot just above the hip, no penetration or buckling by the direct hit. Kincaid swiveled and targeted the tank and fired. The tank exploded in blinding light. One by one, man and mech blasted each tank apart. Kincaid merely disabled the last tank. With no escape, Kincaid walked his Mackie up to the tank, raised a leg, and stomped the tank into the dirt. Jacob Cameron, upon seeing this test, would realize that this mech would become the dominant weapon of war. He dedicated his military budget to producing new mech factories and Mackies all over the hegemony. The Mackie's first real combat test wouldn't happen for 4 years. The 801st Heavy Armored Regiment was the first to incorporate the Mackie. In 2443, the 801st would defend against a raiding party from the Draconis Combine on the planet Styx. A single lance of Mackies, or 4 mechs, was sent to fight an entire company of heavy tanks. This lance would utterly destroy and crush the tank company, leaving only one left to tell of the new terror on the battlefield. Rumors spread across the inner sphere like wildfire. The Terran hegemony had a new weapon of war, and it was terrifying. The Great Houses knew they could not sit idle. They had to find a way to acquire the Mackie. Attempts were immediately made to steal the plans. All attempts were met with deadly consequence. These attempts went on for years. The hegemony was able to closely guard all technology and information about the Mackie. Nearly 15 years later, the Lyrans successfully stole the plans from the hegemony. 6 years later, Draconis Combine commandos acquired the plans from the Lyrans. Slowly, every great house got their hands on information for the Mackie. Director General Cameron knew his technological edge on the battlefield was in jeopardy. He began accelerating his plans to maintain and widen his nation's superior military. Cameron knew that this was now a BattleMech R&D race. The winner would have superior mechs and would dominate the other great houses, including his own. He would push all of his military funding and most of the hegemony's budget not only to continue to produce the Mackie, but later attempted new and more advanced battle mechs. The new budget pushed the nation's finances to the extreme. The once mighty hegemony warship fleet faced massive budget cuts. These budget cuts were so extreme that the fleet went without maintenance for an entire year. It wasn't just the fleet that had its share of cuts. So much of the hegemony's budget was going to Mackie production and BattleMech R&D that the realm was nearly bankrupted. Even at the edge of financial collapse, Director General Jacob Cameron had secured his nation's technological superiority and cemented his legacy for an eternity. So what makes a Mackie a Mackie? Most of the tech in making the Mackie is primitive even for the time it was built. Things like actuators, mini-motors, gyros, and many other components were too new to have been efficient or space-saving. When the Mackie was tested, and even during its first battle, certain components were still a few years away from availability via mass production. These unproven technologies would eventually catch up. Let's dive into the Mackie and a few of its variants. The Mackie MSK-5S was the prototype piloted by Colonel Charles Kincaid. 5S was a behemoth of a mech weighing in at 100 tons. It was built on the prototype Ford Super H QWA3X chassis system. It had 20 tons of diamond-woven armor, which, when compared to today's standards, is an extremely primitive armor type. For the time, this provided an immense amount of protection. The 5S came equipped with 17 single heat sinks and had a Hermes 360 standard fusion engine, allowing it to reach a top speed of 54 kilometers per hour. The exact models, manufacturers of the weapon systems, targeting, tracking, and communication packages for the Mackie and all of its variants have unfortunately been lost to time. What we do know is that the 5S was equipped with a PPC, or particle projectile cannon, in the left arm and an autocannon 5 in the right arm. The AC-5 was fed with 1 ton of ammo for 20 shots. Mounted in the center torso was a single large laser. The MSK-6S was the initial production run of the Mackie. It keeps the left arm mounted PPC. The autocannon 5 was removed from the right arm in favor of an autocannon 10. The AC-10 was given 2 tons of ammo for a total of 16 shots. The 6S also removed the large laser and replaced it with twin medium lasers. Lastly, 2 heat sinks were removed to bring it down to 15 single heat sinks. The 6S kept the Hermes 360 engine and used the same primitive diamond-woven armor. For their time, the 5S and the 6S were heavily protected and were able to destroy nearly anything on the battlefield quickly. Both the 5S and the 6S would have given early mech warriors their very first and most important combat lesson while piloting a mech: managing heat. Both these platforms, when running and firing all their weapons, could cause significant heat buildup. In late 2470, the Mackie would see its first upgrades. The MSK-7A saw a variety of changes and new technology added. The 3 biggest changes were to the engine, armor, and chassis design, making radical leaps forward. The prototype chassis was changed to a more modern standard chassis. The 33-ton Hermes 360 was replaced with a 19-ton 300 Fusion engine. This engine swap alone massively reduced the amount of weight for the 7A. The lighter engine still provided enough output to keep the 7A running at its top speed of 54 kilometers per hour. Additionally, the gyro and cockpit were upgraded to the modern equivalent of standard types, saving even more weight. The primitive armor was replaced with standard armor, which is lighter than the original and still used today. 19 tons of standard armor were used, providing an incredible amount of survivability. To put it in perspective, the 7A has the same amount of armor as the Atlas assault mech, designed nearly 300 years later by Kerensky himself. Due to the amount of weight saved by the engine and other upgrades, the weapons were also improved. The left arm mounted PPC stayed. The right arm was equipped with a massive autocannon 20. The 7A carried 4 tons of ammo for 20 shots. The twin-mounted medium lasers were replaced by 2 large lasers, 1 in each side torso. Finally, the 7A had 21 heat sinks to deal with the massive amount of heat it could generate. The last variant we'll discuss is the MSK-8B. This model was introduced in 2576. The 8B underwent some slight changes. The 8B kept its 300 Fusion engine and its 21 single heat sinks. A half-ton of armor was added, giving it slightly more protection. The 2 torso-mounted large lasers were removed for twin medium lasers mounted in the center torso. The right arm-mounted autocannon also remained and was still fed with 4 tons of ammo. The ammo was now protected by case. This would limit the amount of damage sustained to the mech in the event of an ammo cook-off from heat or from a direct hit of exposed ammo. The left arm was upgraded to twin PPCs. 8B is one heavy hitter, but pilots must be very aware of their weapon management as to not overheat the mech. I decided not to cover each and every variant of the Mackie. If I did, we'd be here for a while. With the signing of the Aries conventions in 2412, the once mighty warship had been sidelined with new rules, morals, and political grandstanding. Although new rules made war fair, they never ended the atrocities nations commit. The introduction of the Mackie revolutionized warfighting, tactics, and strategy for the next 700 years. Needless to say, the Mackie and all other BattleMechs that followed were helped in their battlefield dominance by political shenanigans. The Star League passed Addendum 2 in 2579, which rescinded the Aries Convention. Warships were back on the menu. Even though total war was back through the use of warships, the Mackie was still cemented as the most dominant weapon for ground warfare. Later, during the first two succession wars, the use of total war destroyed or crippled most of the operational warships left after the Kerensky Exodus, along with the facilities to manufacture and maintain them. This would, once again, make the BattleMech the most dominant weapon of war. The Mackie was produced in the Terran hegemony right up until the Amaris Civil War. When General Kerensky left the Inner Sphere during the Exodus, he brought with him as many as 100 Mackies. Outside of the hegemony, after the fall of the Star League, the Mackie was still produced until the Great Wars of Succession began. Even during the first three succession wars, the Mackie was still used by garrison units, militias, and mercenary units throughout the Inner Sphere. Even though newer, better, and deadlier mechs had been produced, the Mackie continued to hold its own in fights with a capable pilot sitting in the cockpit. I suppose seeing a 700-year-old museum piece lumbering across a battlefield serves as a stark reminder of the lineage of more modern battlemechs fighting across the Inner Sphere. The Mackie was a collection of half-thought-out ideas, stuffed with unproven technology, pushed to the forefront of military service by a man with an ego bigger than his hair, to be the savior of a nation. Honestly, it should have never worked. While effective, the test in 2439 was a test of old versus new, proven versus unproven technology. It should have been a disaster. While it did work, the Mackie is a reminder that in warfare, sometimes effective means it just needs to scare the hell out of your opponent. The Mackie did just that. The great houses began a mech-based weapons race, a race that every house lord thought would end with themselves being the supreme nation. While I could go on about the influence the Mackie would provide to future mech designs or warfighting tactics, I don't think I could do it any more justice than this.